From the moment she spotted him, Elena Graves knew something was off. She had spent years working as a flight attendant, moving seamlessly through the aisles of luxury cabins, catering to high-profile passengers who expected nothing less than perfection. First class wasn't just a seat, it was a status, a privilege reserved for the elite. And yet, as she walked down the aisle, her trained eyes scanning the passengers settling into their plush seats, something about the elderly man sitting in 1A made her pause. He was well-dressed, sure, in a navy suit that fit him comfortably, but there was something unpolished about him. His bag, a leather satchel worn from years of use, was nothing like the sleek designer luggage the other passengers carried. He sat with a quiet confidence, but his stillness unnerved her. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, adjusting his seat, or chatting with the flight crew. He simply sat, hands resting on the armrest, as if he had all the time in the world. Elena had seen this before. Passengers who didn't belong, people who slipped through the cracks, who used someone else's boarding pass, who talked their way past the gate agents. It wasn't common, but it happened. And in her experience, hesitation was a red flag. Real first-class passengers exuded a sense of entitlement, an unspoken expectation of service. But this man, he was too composed, too at ease. And it irritated her. She strode toward him, her posture rigid with authority. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying just enough politeness to mask her skepticism, "I believe you may be in the wrong seat." The man lifted his gaze to her, and for the first time, Elena really saw his eyes. They weren't confused, nor were they defiant. They were sharp, alert, the kind of eyes that had seen more than she could ever understand. There was no panic in them, no guilt, just patience. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and retrieved his boarding pass. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if he already knew how this was going to unfold. He held it out to her with steady fingers, waiting. Elena took it quickly, scanning the details. Seat 1A, first class, Henry Calloway. Her grip tightened. The name matched the manifest. The seat was his. There was no mistake. Still, she hesitated. Passengers nearby had started to notice, some stealing quick glances, others pretending to stay immersed in their own world. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his tie, subtly watching the interaction over the rim of his whiskey glass. A woman in a beige designer dress flipped through a magazine, her posture stiff, her page turning slower than before. The energy in the cabin shifted, silent but heavy. Elena forced a tight-lipped smile as she handed the ticket back. "Just a routine check, Mr. Calloway. Mistakes happen." The words came out forced, clipped with an edge of irritation. The man, Henry, didn't say a word. He simply took the boarding pass, slipping it back into his jacket with that same maddening calm. He didn't gloat, didn't demand an apology, and somehow that was worse. Elena turned on her heel, walking briskly toward the galley, her pulse hammering. She had been so sure that she would catch him in a lie, that she would expose some trick, that she would call security and put an end to whatever scheme he was pulling. But now she just felt exposed, as if she had been the one caught doing something wrong. And she didn't like it. She lingered near the coffee station, hands gripping the edge of the counter, jaw clenched. This wasn't over. It didn't sit right with her. People didn't just sit like that. Composed, indifferent. He hadn't even reacted. No embarrassment, no indignation, nothing. It was as if he had expected her suspicion, as if this wasn't the first time someone had questioned whether he belonged. Mira Patel, a fellow flight attendant, stepped into the galley, tucking a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. "What was that about?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Elena exhaled sharply. "I just have a bad feeling about him." Mira frowned. "The guy in 1A? He's on the manifest, Elena." "Well, that doesn't mean it's his ticket," Elena countered, arms crossing over her chest. "People find ways to slip past security all the time." Mira hesitated, glancing back toward the cabin. He scanned in at the gate without issue. If there was a problem, they would have flagged it. Elena huffed, shaking her head. "Something's off. I need to be sure." Mira's expression wavered, uncertain. "Elena, maybe let it go. You checked his ticket. It's fine." But it wasn't fine, not to Elena. Because now it wasn't just about him. Now it was about her. She had questioned him in front of the entire first-class cabin. She had cast doubt, made a scene, small but noticeable. And if she backed off now, if she let this go, she would be admitting she had been wrong. And Elena Graves didn't make mistakes. Her eyes flicked toward the overhead compartments. The leather bag. His bag. If she couldn't prove he didn't belong, maybe she could prove there was something wrong with him. Her decision was made before she could second-guess it. With careful steps, she moved back into the aisle, her gaze locked onto 1A. Henry Calloway was still seated, still impossibly calm. She squared her shoulders and approached, her professional smile back in place. "Sir," she said, her tone smoother now, almost apologetic, but not quite. "I need to conduct a routine security check of carry-on luggage." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his eyes. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, as if he had seen this before. He exhaled softly, his lips pressing into a thin line before he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply stepped aside. Elena reached for the overhead bin, her fingers brushing against the worn leather handle of his bag. The plane was quiet now, the hum of the engines the only background noise. She unzipped the bag, expecting, what? Documents that weren't his? A concealed item that would validate her instincts? A reason to justify what she had done? Instead, all she found were neatly folded clothes, a leather-bound notebook, and a newspaper. Nothing. Nothing suspicious. Nothing out of place. Nothing that proved her right. A sharp pang of humiliation twisted in her chest. She had been so sure. And yet, in that moment, as she zipped the bag shut, it wasn't Henry Calloway who had been exposed. It was her. There was something about Henry Calloway that unsettled people. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because of the way he carried himself. He was a man who did not seek approval, a man who did not beg for respect. He simply existed in a way that made it clear he had already earned it. To the untrained eye, he was just an elderly passenger in a well-tailored navy suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp brown eyes quietly observing the world around him. He moved with an effortless precision, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. There was a steadiness in him, a presence that made people hesitate before speaking. He wasn't the kind of man you ignored, nor was he the kind of man you dismissed. He was something else entirely, something deeper, something heavier, something most people couldn't quite define, but instinctively knew. He had seen things, endured things, survived things. And while no one on that plane knew it, Henry Calloway had once commanded the very skies they were flying through. For decades, his name had been etched into history books, whispered with reverence in halls of military academies, honored in ceremonies where men stood a little straighter at the mention of him. He had not only flown aircraft, he had led fleets, had made life or death decisions in the cockpit, had navigated enemy fire with nothing but instinct and training keeping him alive. He had been a brigadier general, a man whose decisions had shaped battles, whose experience had saved lives, whose very presence had demanded the respect of thousands. And now he was here, a passenger, an old man with a military pin on his lapel, sitting in first class, waiting for a flight to take off. He had never been the kind to seek luxury, had never cared for extravagant displays of wealth, but this seat, this first-class ticket, hadn't been about indulgence. It had been a gift. A quiet nod of appreciation from the very airline he had once helped keep safe in the skies. A gesture from men and women who knew exactly who he was. And so he had accepted it, not because he needed it, but because, for once, he allowed himself the smallest luxury of comfort. But now, as he sat in seat 1A, his fingers resting lightly on the armrests, he could feel the weight of someone's stare. He had felt it before. The look. The kind that came from people who had already decided who he was before he had spoken a single word. When the flight attendant, Elena Graves, had approached him with that clipped, impatient tone, he had already known where this was going. He had seen it happen countless times, to others, to himself. The assumption, the doubt, the quiet dismissal that people like her never had to second guess. And yet, as she questioned his presence, as she scanned his boarding pass with a flicker of confusion, as she handed it back with a forced, almost begrudging smile, Henry Calloway did what he had always done. He said nothing. He let her walk away. Because what was there to say? What did it matter that she had questioned him? He had been questioned before, by men with more power, by people with sharper tongues and heavier weapons. He had been doubted in places where doubt could cost a man his life. He had been challenged by forces stronger than a mere flight attendant with too much confidence and too little experience. So no, Henry Calloway did not argue. He did not protest. Because men like him knew better. Men like him knew that real power didn't come from raising your voice. It didn't come from proving a point to someone who had already made up their mind. Real power came from patience, from letting people expose themselves, from knowing that, in the end, truth always won. And so he had let her believe she had authority over him. He had let her take the boarding pass as if she could erase his years of service with a simple glance. He had let her walk away with the smug certainty of someone who thought they had restored order. Because Henry Calloway had learned something long ago, time has a way of revealing people for who they truly are. And as he sat there staring out the window, feeling the engines hum beneath him, he knew something that Elena Graves did not. She had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. The flight would take off, the hours would pass, and at some point, she would make the mistake she didn't realize she was walking toward. She would push too far. She would assume too much. And then, just like that, her world would tilt beneath her feet. Because the skies she thought she ruled, they had never belonged to her. They had belonged to him long before she ever set foot on that plane. And when this was over, she would finally understand. The man she had tried to humiliate, he didn't just belong in first class. He had owned the skies more than she ever would. Elena Graves had always trusted her instincts. It was what had made her one of the most respected flight attendants in the airline. She had an eye for detail, a sense for trouble, and a reputation for keeping order. No one sneaked past her watchful gaze. No one manipulated their way into a seat they hadn't paid for. And no one disrupted the precise, controlled environment she maintained at 30,000 feet. So when Henry Calloway had settled into seat 1A, composed and unbothered, something about him nagged at her. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone else to see, but she felt it deep in her gut. She just knew. That feeling didn't go away, even after she checked his ticket, even after Mara Patel, the junior flight attendant, confirmed that his name was on the manifest. Even after she saw the looks of mild disapproval from a few first-class passengers who had witnessed the initial exchange, logic told her to drop it. Professionalism told her to move on. But Elena couldn't. She wouldn't. Because something wasn't right. The first-class cabin moved on as if nothing had happened. Businessmen adjusted their ties, sipped their whiskey, and tapped away on their laptops. A socialite scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone, ignoring the world around her. The hum of conversation, the occasional clinking of ice against glass, it was all normal. But not to Elena. She had watched Henry Calloway closely as she returned to the galley. He didn't go back to reading a book or checking his phone like everyone else. He didn't nod off into a light sleep. He simply sat there, waiting. For what? The thought itched at her. Elena, Mara's voice was soft behind her, hesitant. You really think he doesn't belong here? Elena exhaled sharply. I know something's off. Mara hesitated before glancing back toward the cabin. Maybe he's just different. That word, different, it made Elena's skin prickle with frustration. That's how it always started. An excuse, an assumption that maybe she was the problem instead of the person she was questioning. But that wasn't how it worked. Elena didn't target people at random. She followed her instincts. She trusted them, and her instincts were never wrong. She had seen it too many times before. People trying to slip past security, manipulating their way into first class, hoping no one would question them. It was a game to them, but not to her. She was responsible for that cabin. And if Henry Calloway thought he could outmaneuver her, he was wrong. So she watched him. Minutes passed. Passengers relaxed, the tension from earlier melting away into the quiet comfort of luxury travel. Elena continued moving through the cabin, pouring drinks, handing out warm towels, smiling when necessary. But every time she turned, her eyes flicked back to 1A. Still calm, still waiting, still wrong. Her fingers tightened around the tray she carried. He was just too composed. No small talk, no unnecessary movements. It was as if he was expecting something. And that was enough to make her act. She moved swiftly, her decision made. Mara saw her heading toward the cockpit and frowned. "Elena, what are you doing?" "I need to check something," Elena said briskly. Mara's brow furrowed. "We already checked." "I need to be sure." Mara stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Elena, if you're wrong, I'm not." And with that, she pushed past her, making her way toward the cockpit. She didn't hesitate when she reached the communications panel. Picking up the phone, she dialed the pilot's channel. A click. "This is Captain Harrington," came the steady voice from the other end. Elena straightened. "Captain, I have concerns about a passenger in first class." A pause, then, "What kind of concerns?" She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I believe he may have gained access to first class without proper authorization." Another pause. "And do you have reason to believe that?" Elena swallowed. "It's a feeling, sir. I'd like to cross-check his information against security records." Silence stretched between them. Then a slow sigh from the captain. "Miss Graves, is his name on the manifest?" "Yes, but..." "Did he scan in at the gate without issue?" "Yes, but..." "Then we do not investigate passengers based on a feeling." Frustration burned in her chest. "Sir, I wouldn't request this if I wasn't sure something was off." "Miss Graves," the captain's voice was sharp now, his patience thinning. "We are mid-flight. If this is a security concern, then report it properly. Otherwise, this conversation is over." The line went dead. Elena stood there, gripping the receiver, heat rushing to her face. He didn't believe her. No one did. She was not wrong. Mara appeared beside her again, her expression unreadable. "What now?" Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'll handle it myself." Mara's eyes widened. "Elena, no." But she was already moving. Down the aisle, past the indifferent passengers, back to seat 1A. Henry Calloway turned his head as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Sir," she said smoothly, "I need you to step into the aisle." His brow lifted slightly. "For what reason?" She kept her posture straight, professional. "Routine security check of carry-on baggage." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, just understanding. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet. Elena reached for the overhead bin, her fingers gripping the handle of his leather bag. The moment of truth. She pulled it down, placed it on the seat, and unzipped it. Passengers had started to notice now. A hush fell over first class, eyes flicking toward them, whispers passing between them. Elena reached inside, expecting to find something. A fake ID, a stolen credit card, a reason. But all she found were neatly folded clothes, a leather-bound notebook, and a newspaper. Nothing suspicious, nothing wrong, nothing that justified what she had just done. She had been so sure. Her throat tightened as Henry Calloway watched her zip the bag shut. "Find what you were looking for?" His voice was calm, but his eyes told her something else entirely. She had lost. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Passengers exchanged looks. The businessman with the whiskey glass smirked, and Elena Graves knew, in that moment, that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Elena Graves had spent her entire career believing she was the one in control, the one who maintained order in the skies, who ensured that rules were followed, who made decisions with absolute certainty. She had built her reputation on it. Authority wasn't given, it was earned. And she had earned hers through years of unwavering discipline, through countless flights where she had called the shots and made the hard calls. But now, standing in the aisle of first class with every passenger watching, with Henry Calloway's calm, knowing gaze locked onto her, she realized something chilling. She was not in control anymore. She had lost it. And worse, she had lost it in front of everyone. Passengers weren't just watching out of idle curiosity anymore. They were engaged. A businessman had put his laptop aside to observe the unfolding scene. A woman in designer heels tapped her perfectly manicured fingers against her armrest, her lips curling into something that might have been amusement or judgment. A young couple whispered to each other, occasionally flicking their eyes toward Elena as if she was the subject of some unfolding drama on their in-flight entertainment screen. She had become the show. And Henry Calloway? He wasn't the villain in this story. She was. Elena clenched her jaw as she zipped his bag shut, lifting it with more force than necessary before handing it back to him. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, forcing the words out as smoothly as possible, though her throat felt tight, dry. She wanted to walk away. She needed to walk away. But she had already done too much damage, because Henry Calloway didn't just let it go. He sat down slowly, his movements precise, deliberate, his expression still unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but filled with quiet power, he said, "I expected better from you." The words cut, not because they were loud, not because they were angry, but because they were true. Elena knew it the moment he said them, and worse, so did everyone else. The shame pulled in her chest like a lead weight. She turned sharply and strode toward the galley, ignoring the murmurs in her wake, ignoring the way her own hands trembled as she reached for the counter to steady herself. Mara was waiting for her. "Elena," she whispered, her voice urgent, eyes wide. "You need to stop." Elena exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You saw him, Mara. You saw how he acted. He was too what?" Mara's voice was sharper now, her usual quiet deference gone. "Too calm? Too caustic? Too sure of himself?" Elena's mouth opened, but she had no words. Mara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're looking for something that isn't there, and now everyone knows it." A sharp chime over the intercom interrupted them. "Miss Graves, please report to the cockpit." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. The captain never called flight attendants to the cockpit mid-flight. It was a silent rule. If something was wrong, it was handled swiftly, quietly. Unless it wasn't just a small problem anymore. Unless it had already spiraled into something far worse. Elena swallowed hard and walked toward the cockpit, her legs feeling like lead with every step. As the door hissed open, she stepped inside to find Captain Harrington turned in his seat, arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold disapproval. "Miss Graves," he said smoothly, his voice unreadable. "Do you know who Henry Calloway is?" Elena blinked. "Yes," she said automatically. "A passenger." Harrington exhaled, rubbing his temple like a man who had just heard something deeply disappointing. Then with quiet finality he said, "He's a brigadier general, a war hero, and more importantly, his wife owns this airline." The words slammed into Elena like a physical force. Silence stretched, suffocating. She felt the breath leave her lungs. "What?" she choked out, barely able to process the weight of the sentence. Harrington's expression didn't change. "Eleanor Calloway, the CEO of this airline, the woman who signs your paycheck, the woman who built this company from the ground up, the woman who just received a phone call about how her husband was humiliated on one of her own planes." Elena's stomach plummeted. Everything had just changed. This wasn't about an overreaction anymore. This wasn't about a simple mistake. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Harrington leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We're still 3 hours from landing, Miss Graves. When we do, there will be security waiting for you at the gate. And then you'll be taken directly to Mrs. Calloway's office." Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. She had handled unruly passengers. She had dealt with difficult situations. But she had never faced this, a complaint to the CEO. A direct order from the woman who owned the airline. This wasn't just a scolding. This wasn't just a suspension. This was a reckoning. "Captain," Elena started, her voice hollow, desperate, but Harrington held up a hand. "No excuses," he said simply. "I suggest you spend the rest of this flight thinking about what you're going to say when we land." With that, he turned back toward the controls, signaling that the conversation was over. Elena stood frozen for several seconds before forcing herself to move, stepping back through the cockpit door as it hissed shut behind her. She had no plan, no way out. Passengers still glanced at her, their expressions unreadable. Some were indifferent, others looked satisfied. But the worst part, Henry Calloway wasn't even watching her anymore. He had already won. Her chest tightened. For the first time in her life, Elena Graves was the one with no power. She had spent years believing herself untouchable, believing that she made the rules, that her judgment was final. And now she was waiting for judgment. She walked back to the galley in a daze, hands trembling as she braced herself against the counter. Mara approached cautiously. Elena. Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. Mara, she whispered, voice hoarse. What happens when we land? Mara hesitated before answering. Everything changes. Elena felt something cold settle deep inside her chest. Because she knew, without a doubt, this flight might land, but her career? It was already in free fall. Clarissa Vaughn had never been forced to apologize before. Not really. She had spent years in the sky wearing her uniform like armor, moving through flights with an air of authority that left no room for doubt. She was the one who maintained order, who ensured everything ran smoothly, who made the decisions and never questioned them. But now, as she stood in the aisle of first class staring down at Henry Calloway, the man she had tried to humiliate, the man she had assumed didn't belong, she felt something she had never felt before. The weight of every single set of eyes on her. The businessman who had been watching since the beginning sipped his whiskey, waiting to see what she would do next. The woman with the designer purse had abandoned her magazine entirely, her gaze locked onto Clarissa like a spectator at a high-stakes event. The older gentleman, 2 rows back, leaned in slightly, his brow raised, as if he already knew how this would play out. Even Mara Patel, her fellow flight attendant, the woman who had spent the entire flight silently warning her, stood near the galley, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. And then there was Henry Calloway, sitting there composed, calm, as if he had been here before, as if he had seen this exact moment coming long before she had. Clarissa swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She had no choice. She had been summoned to the cockpit, ordered by Captain Harrington to make things right, to offer an apology, to fix the damage she had done before they landed, and she had to face an even greater reckoning. So she forced a breath into her lungs, squared her shoulders, and spoke. Mr. Calloway, she began, her voice steady, professional. I'd like to apologize for earlier. A pause. The air in the cabin shifted. Clarissa felt it immediately. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't enough. They weren't right. They weren't real. She had meant to sound sincere, but instead, she sounded mechanical, like she was reading from a script, like she wasn't apologizing because she was sorry, but because she had been told to. Henry Calloway didn't react. He simply blinked once, slowly, and then tilted his head just enough to show he was waiting for more, waiting for the truth. Clarissa's stomach tightened. She could feel the tension rising, could feel the passengers watching her with rapt attention, waiting to see if she would break, if she would do the right thing or continue to pretend she hadn't done anything wrong. She licked her lips and tried again. She hesitated. I was just following protocol. Mara let out the softest exhale from the galley. Clarissa's chest burned. Henry's eyes remained locked onto hers, unblinking. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, No, you weren't. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't an attack, but it hit harder than if he had stood up and shouted at her. Because it was true. Clarissa felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She wanted to defend herself, to argue, to say something that would make this situation feel less like an execution in front of an entire cabin full of people. But she couldn't, because she had already lost. She had searched his bag for no reason. She had questioned him, doubted him, humiliated him, not because there had been any real threat, but because of an assumption, because of her own bias. Her throat tightened. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the silence in the cabin stretched so thick, so suffocating, it felt like everyone was holding their breath. She had to say something, so she forced herself to speak. I was wrong. It was barely a whisper, but it was the first real thing she had said all night. Something flickered in Henry's eyes, something she couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just understanding. Clarissa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The moment was over. She had said the words, but it didn't feel like enough, because an apology wasn't just words. It was what happened next. She turned quickly, walking away before she could see the reactions of the passengers, before she could witness the lingering expressions of disapproval, of disappointment, before she could see what she had become. As she reached the galley, Mara was waiting for her. Clarissa avoided her gaze, reaching for the counter, trying to focus on something, Anything that would make her feel like she still had some control over this situation. But Mara's voice was quiet, steady. That wasn't an apology. Clarissa squeezed her eyes shut. She already knew that. She already knew. And yet, knowing it didn't make the sinking feeling in her stomach any easier to bear, because she could feel it in her bones. Something had changed. And when this plane landed, her world was never going to be the same again. Clarissa Vaughn had always been the one in control. She was the one who walked through the airport with quiet confidence. Her uniform crisp, her posture perfect. She was the one who enforced the rules, who made the decisions, who determined who was treated with respect and who wasn't. She was the one people listened to, the one passengers feared when they stepped out of line. But not today. Today, she was the one being escorted. The second the plane landed, the usual flurry of movement filled the cabin, passengers unbuckling their seatbelts too soon, reaching for their overhead bags, checking their phones for missed messages. But Clarissa, she barely heard any of it, because standing just beyond the jet bridge, waiting for her, were two uniformed officers. They weren't there for a routine security check. They were there for her. Her stomach plummeted. Passengers who had once ignored her, who had once seen her as nothing more than an attendant moving through the aisles, now watched her, some subtle, some not. The businessman with the whiskey glass raised an eyebrow, exchanging a quiet glance with the woman in designer heels. The young couple who had been whispering before were openly staring now. She felt exposed. Mara was beside her, silent, her expression unreadable. But Clarissa knew. She knew exactly what Mara was thinking. You did this to yourself. The flight crew had already been dismissed, filing out of the cabin as usual. Clarissa should have been walking with them. Instead, she was the only one left. One of the officers, a broad man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward. Miss Vaughn. Clarissa swallowed hard. She forced herself to stand straight, to keep her chin up, to hold on to any shred of dignity she had left. Yes? You'll need to come with us. Passengers froze in their movements. The whispers turned into quiet murmurs. Clarissa clenched her jaw, nodding stiffly. She wouldn't let them see her break. She stepped off the plane, walking past passengers still lingering near the gate, feeling their gazes burning into her back. The officers didn't cuff her. They didn't need to. The humiliation alone was enough to feel like she was being led away in chains. Her legs felt heavier with every step as she was guided through the terminal, not toward the crew lounge, not toward the employee exits, but deeper into the airport, toward the executive offices. She had never been in this part of the building before. This was where decisions were made, where policies were created, where people like her didn't belong unless they were being called in for something important. And today, she was important for all the wrong reasons. It was home. The glass doors slid open, and suddenly, she was inside. The sleek, modern space was eerily silent. No rush of travelers, no frantic calls over the intercom, no hum of engines, just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. A receptionist barely looked up as the officers led her past the front desk and down a long hallway. And then, they stopped. A tall man with silver-streaked hair and a suit so sharp it looked like it could cut through steel was waiting for her outside a conference room. His expression was unreadable, his presence heavy with authority. Clarissa knew who he was. Richard Lane, head of employee relations. She had seen him once before, giving a speech about integrity, about how the airline was built on trust. She had never expected to meet him like this. Without a word, he gestured toward the open door. She stepped inside. The room was cold, not in temperature, but in feeling. The walls were bare, the long, polished table unwelcoming. And sitting at the head of it, Henry Calloway. Clarissa's breath hitched. She had never seen her in person before. The CEO of the airline. The woman who built this company from the ground up. The woman who was staring directly at her. Clarissa forced herself to sit in the chair across from her. Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then, Eleanor leaned forward, folding her hands together. You disrespected my husband. The words slammed into Clarissa like a freight train. She had expected a corporate lecture, a rundown of policies, a rehearsed script about customer service. But this was personal. Clarissa swallowed, her throat dry. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Tell me, Miss Vaughn, what made you so sure he didn't belong? Clarissa felt her pulse thunder. She could lie. She could make an excuse. She could defend herself. But she had already done enough of that. So instead, she said nothing. The silence stretched. Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. You already had the answer before he even opened his mouth, didn't you? Clarissa blinked rapidly, fighting the sting behind her eyes. She couldn't cry. Not here, not now. Richard Lane finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled. As of now, Miss Vaughn, you are officially suspended pending further review. Effective immediately. The words rang in her ears. Suspended. She wasn't fired. Not yet. But she wasn't a flight attendant anymore. Everything she had built. Gone. Eleanor's voice cut through the haze in her mind. You should consider yourself lucky it's not immediate termination. Lucky. Clarissa let out a slow, shaky breath. Her career was slipping through her fingers, and somehow she was supposed to feel lucky. Richard Lane slid a formal letter across the table. Security will escort you out. It was over, just like that. Clarissa stood on shaky legs, gripping the edge of the table for balance. As she turned to leave, Eleanor spoke one last time. You don't get to decide who belongs. Clarissa flinched. She walked out of the room without another word, past the silent reception area, past the security officers who had been waiting. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times before, but this time, she wasn't coming back. And the worst part? She deserved it. Clarissa Vaughn sat across from Henry Calloway, her fingers clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. She had spent years walking through airports like she owned the place, dictating who was treated with kindness and who wasn't. She had believed she was in control, untouchable. But now, as she sat in a cold executive office, stripped of her uniform, stripped of the authority she had once wielded so confidently, she had never felt smaller. And the woman sitting across from her knew it. Henry Calloway, the CEO, the woman whose name was stamped on every paycheck Clarissa had ever received, the woman who had built this airline from the ground up, the woman who, until today, had been nothing more than an untouchable figure in company emails and framed photographs. But now she wasn't untouchable. Now she was Clarissa's judge, jury, and executioner. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying Clarissa with piercing, calculated eyes. Tell me something, she said, her voice calm. Too calm. When you first questioned my husband, what exactly made you think he didn't belong? Clarissa's throat went dry. This was the moment, the one where she could try to salvage what little dignity she had left. She could have said anything. She could have blamed protocol. She could have said she was doing her job, that she was ensuring the integrity of first class, that she had been following security procedures. But she knew Eleanor wouldn't accept excuses. So instead, Clarissa forced herself to look at the table, unable to meet the woman's gaze, and whispered, I don't know. A beat of silence, and then a quiet chuckle. But it wasn't amusement. It was disappointment. Clarissa felt it like a knife to the ribs. Eleanor leaned forward, folding her hands. You don't know, she repeated, as if the words tasted foreign in her mouth. That's the best you can give me? Clarissa exhaled shakily, forcing herself to look up. I thought, she swallowed, I thought something was off. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. And what exactly was off about a man sitting in his assigned seat, minding his own business? Clarissa flinched. There was no way out of this. No way to twist the truth into something more acceptable. Something that would make her seem like anything other than what she was. She had spent years enforcing the rules, making snap judgments about passengers, deciding, without ever really thinking about it, who deserved to be in first class and who didn't. And today, she had done it to the wrong man. Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. My husband didn't report you. Clarissa blinked. What? She croaked. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Henry didn't file the complaint. Clarissa's pulse thundered in her ears. If it hadn't been him, Eleanor gave a knowing smile, but there was nothing warm about it. You humiliated a man who has spent his entire life serving this country. A man who has more experience in the sky than you ever will. And do you know what he did? She paused, letting the silence sink its claws in. Clarissa shook her head. Eleanor's eyes burned into her. He let you. Clarissa's breath caught. He didn't fight back. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't call for your supervisor. He let you humiliate yourself. Clarissa's stomach twisted into knots because she realized that's exactly what had happened. Henry Calloway had known. From the second she questioned him, he had known where this was going, and he had let her walk into her own downfall, one step at a time. Clarissa swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump forming in her throat. If he didn't report me, she asked, her voice unsteady, then who did? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Who do you think? It hit Clarissa like a slap. His wife, the woman sitting across from her, the woman who now held her future in her hands. Clarissa squeezed her eyes shut. She had spent her whole career believing she was the one in control. She had spent this whole flight believing Henry Calloway was the one who didn't belong. But the truth, she was the one who didn't belong. She had built her authority on assumptions, on the silent belief that she was the one who got to decide. And now she was being shown what real authority looked like. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. You don't get to decide who belongs here, Miss Vaughn. You never did. Clarissa swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping the edge of her seat. She wanted to argue, she wanted to beg. But for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Eleanor sighed. I should fire you, she said bluntly. Right here, right now. Clarissa froze. Her breath caught in her chest, panic swelling beneath her skin. But then, Eleanor slid a document across the table. Clarissa blinked down at it. Not a termination letter, a reassignment. Ground crew. Clarissa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Eleanor studied her reaction for a moment before speaking again. You spent years enforcing the rules, Miss Vaughn. Maybe it's time you learn what it's like to be on the other side of them. Clarissa's heart hammered in her chest. Ground crew. It wasn't a second chance. It was a demotion, a punishment, a lesson. Clarissa inhaled shakily, forcing herself to reach for the pen. Her hands trembled as she signed her name. When she looked back up, Eleanor's expression hadn't changed. You start Monday. Clarissa nodded numbly. She had walked into this room expecting to fight for her career. Instead, she had barely survived it. And as she stood, smoothing out her skirt with shaking hands, she realized this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something else. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But for the first time in her life, she was ready to listen. Clarissa Vaughn sat alone on a cold metal bench outside the airport, her hands clenched together, her nail digging into her skin so hard it hurt. But she didn't loosen her grip. Not yet. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times before, head high, shoulders squared, uniform pristine. She had carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged, of someone who knew her place. But now she didn't know where she belonged at all. She wasn't walking through the terminal like she owned it. She wasn't stepping onto a plane ready to take command of the aisles. She wasn't in charge anymore. She was just another person sitting outside the airport, stripped of her authority, stripped of her uniform, stripped of everything that had once made her feel important. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest, heavy and suffocating. For hours, she had told herself this wasn't fair, that she had just been doing her job, that Henry Calloway had been too calm, too still, too composed, that he had given her a reason to question him. But the truth was worse than anything she wanted to admit. She hadn't questioned him because of security concerns. She hadn't searched his bag because she feared for the safety of the passengers. She had done it because she had already decided, before he even spoke, before he even moved, that he didn't belong. And now, sitting here with nothing but her own thoughts to keep her company, she couldn't outrun that truth any longer. A gust of wind swept through the open space outside the airport, biting against her skin. She shivered. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years making snap judgments about other people, deciding who deserved to be in first class and who didn't, deciding who needed to be watched more carefully, who needed to be questioned. And now the roles had reversed. She was the one being judged. She was the one people were whispering about. She had felt it the moment she walked through the terminal, security escorting her out, passengers turning their heads as she passed. She had seen the knowing looks, the quiet smirks, the flickers of satisfaction. She had heard the murmurs. Is that her? She's the one who got suspended. She brought it on herself. And the worst part? They were right. Clarissa inhaled shakily, forcing herself to look up. Across the street, a giant digital billboard flickered to life, playing an advertisement for the airline. A smiling flight attendant, happy passengers, a promise of luxury, of warmth, of a world that felt just out of reach. That was supposed to be her world. And now, she had no idea if she would ever set foot on a plane again. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She hesitated for a long moment. Then with slow, deliberate movements, she typed a name into the search bar. Henry Calloway. The results loaded instantly. Her breath caught. Brigadier General Henry Calloway, a decorated war hero, a man who had led soldiers through combat, who had flown missions she couldn't even begin to understand, who had spent his life serving a country that she had never sacrificed for, a man who had seen more, endured more, lost more than she ever would, and she had treated him like an imposter. She squeezed her eyes shut. The truth crashed over her, violent and unforgiving. She hadn't just wronged him, she had adulted him. She had reduced him to nothing more than a suspicion, a problem, a moment of misplaced power that had led to her own downfall. And the worst part? He hadn't even fought back. She had searched his bag in front of an entire first-class cabin. She had humiliated him, expecting anger, expecting resistance. But he had given her nothing. He had let her do it, because he had known. He had known that time would take care of people like her, that she would ruin herself. And she had. Clarissa let out a shuddering breath, pressing a hand to her forehead. She wanted to fix it. She wanted to go back onto that plane and undo everything. But she couldn't. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Her stomach twisted. She already knew what it was. A message from the airline. Her final evaluation meeting was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. A final chance to explain herself. A final chance to beg. She exhaled sharply, her grip tightening around her phone. For years, she had believed that being in control meant never being wrong, that admitting fault was a sign of weakness, that as long as she enforced the rules, she could never be the problem. But now she knew the truth. She had been wrong. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to start over. She wasn't sure what she would say tomorrow. She wasn't even sure if she deserved another chance. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to fight it. For the first time in her life, she was going to listen. Clarissa Vaughn sat in the executive office, her heart pounding so violently against her ribs that she thought it might shatter. The room was silent, too silent. No comforting hum of an engine, no voices buzzing through an intercom. Just the quiet, heavy presence of Eleanor Calloway, the woman who held her career in her hands. She had imagined this moment differently. She had expected anger, a sharp, unforgiving speech about professionalism, about failure, about how people like her didn't deserve a second chance. She had expected an immediate termination, a formal escort out of the building, her name erased from every roster, her years of service reduced to a mistake she could never take back. But what she got was so much worse. Eleanor Calloway leaned forward, folding her hands, her expression unreadable. "You're lucky, Miss Vaughn," she said, her voice smooth but deadly. "I don't believe in throwing people away over a single mistake." Clarissa swallowed hard, her throat dry. Mistake. Such a simple word for something so devastating. "But make no mistake," Eleanor continued, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "This isn't about mercy. This is about whether you understand what you did." Clarissa exhaled shakily. "I do," she whispered. I was wrong." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Wrong about what?" Clarissa hesitated, the answer caught in her throat. Wrong for assuming Henry Calloway didn't belong. Wrong for humiliating a man who had more honor in his little finger than she had ever earned in her entire career. Wrong for turning a moment of power into a moment of disgrace. She could say all of that. She could pour it out, raw and broken, hoping it would be enough. But she knew the truth. Words meant nothing. Not anymore. Eleanor Calloway didn't want an apology. She wanted proof. And that was when Clarissa saw it, the document on the table. Not a termination letter, a reassignment. Her breath caught. Ground crew. Not a flight attendant, not first class, ground crew, a punishment, a lesson, a chance to be humbled in a way that she had never known before. Eleanor let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You've spent years enforcing the rules, Miss Vaughn," she said quietly, "but you never understood the responsibility that comes with that power. You thought your job was to decide who belonged. You were wrong." Clarissa's hands shook as she reached for the paper. She had never been powerless before. She had been the one in charge, the one people listened to, the one who dictated who got respect and who didn't. And now she was being given a choice that didn't feel like a choice at all. Accept the demotion and start over, or walk away and lose everything. Clarissa's fingers curled around the pen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that she had worked too hard, that she had earned her place in first class, that she had given years of her life to this job. But none of that mattered now, because power meant nothing if you didn't deserve it. And today, she had proven she didn't. She couldn't prove herself with words. The only thing that mattered was what she did next. Clarissa took a shaky breath and signed her name. The moment the pen left the paper, it felt real. It was done. There was no going back. Eleanor Calloway took the document, scanned it over briefly, then nodded. "You start Monday." Clarissa nodded stiffly, trying to steady her breathing. She stood on shaking legs, smoothing her skirt out of habit, and as she turned to leave, Eleanor spoke one last time. "Miss Vaughn." Clarissa stopped, forcing herself to meet her gaze. Eleanor's expression didn't soften. "Don't waste this." Clarissa swallowed hard. "I won't." And for the first time since stepping into that office, she meant it. She had lost everything: her title, her authority, the respect of her peers. But maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a way forward. Clarissa Vaughn stood outside the airport, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She wasn't in uniform anymore. She wasn't walking with the same authority, the same confidence that she once carried like a shield. Instead, she stood there, still and quiet, as if the weight of the last 24 hours had finally settled on her shoulders. She had made her choice. She had accepted the demotion. And now, as she watched passengers stream in and out of the terminal, people with their own stories, their own destinations, their own worries, she realized something. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that flight yesterday. For years, she had believed that power came from being in control. That respect was something she could demand simply because she wore a uniform. That authority meant being right, even when she wasn't. But now she understood that power had never been about control. It had been about responsibility. It had been about treating people with dignity, with fairness, not deciding who deserved respect and who didn't, not assuming, not letting pride dictate her actions. She exhaled slowly, letting the thoughts settle. It wouldn't be easy. Stepping into that airport as ground crew instead of a flight attendant would be humiliating. She would have to face her former co-workers, the ones who had once respected the ones who had seen her at her best and at her worst. They would whisper, they would judge, they would talk behind her back. And for the first time in her life, she wouldn't be able to stop them. But she would be able to prove that she was more than her mistakes. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. With a deep breath, Clarissa pulled out her phone and stared at the message confirming her reassignment. First shift, Monday morning, 5:30 a.m. She clenched her jaw. No luxury first-class cabins, no fine wine service, no prestigious passengers to attend to, just luggage, just boarding passes, just the basics of travel, the very foundation she had once looked down on. But maybe for the first time in her life, starting from the bottom was exactly what she needed. She glanced across the street, where a sleek black car was parked, and standing beside it, watching her with quiet patience, was Henry Calloway. Clarissa's breath caught. She had assumed she would never see him again. That after today, after everything, he would move on, never giving her a second thought. But he was still here, waiting. She hesitated before stepping forward, her shoes clicking against the pavement as she closed the distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Henry gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. Clarissa cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I I just wanted to say, you don't need to, he interrupted, his voice steady but firm. Clarissa swallowed. I do. Henry studied her for a moment before exhaling softly. All right. She took a shaky breath. I was wrong. Henry said nothing, allowing her to continue. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about how I handled everything on that flight. I let my own pride, my own assumptions, get in the way of doing my job the right way. And she swallowed hard. I'm sorry. For a long moment, Henry didn't respond. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. Not mockingly, not smugly, but with quiet understanding. You know, he said after a moment, I didn't stay because I wanted an apology. Clarissa frowned slightly. Then why did you? Henry's expression softened. Because I wanted to see if you'd learn something from it. She let out a breath. I did. Good, he nodded. Then maybe it wasn't a wasted lesson after all. Clarissa felt something shift in her chest, a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. For so long, she had been waiting for someone to tell her she was right. Now, she was just grateful someone had shown her where she had gone wrong. Henry straightened. You've got work to do, Miss Vaughn. I hope you make the most of it. Clarissa nodded. I will. With one last glance, Henry stepped into his car, the door shutting with a quiet click. And just like that, he was gone. Clarissa turned back toward the airport, the place she had once ruled with an iron grip. Now she was just another employee. But this time, she wasn't walking through those doors as someone who thought she knew everything. She was walking in as someone ready to learn. True power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. Being in charge doesn't mean making others feel small. It means treating everyone with dignity and fairness. Assumptions can destroy opportunities. One moment of misplaced judgment can change everything. Think before you act. Second chances are rare. Don't waste them. Clarissa was given a chance to redeem herself. Not everyone gets that. If life gives you an opportunity to make things right, take it. Growth comes from humility. Clarissa had to lose everything to realize what really mattered. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that shape us the most. The past doesn't define you, what you do next does. She could have walked away, let her pride dictate her future. Instead, she chose to rebuild herself from the ground up. What do you think? Did Clarissa make the right choice? If you believe in second chances and personal growth, comment below and show your support. Like this video if you think we all deserve a chance to grow and change. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Because sometimes the best stories aren't just about where we fall, they're about how we rise.